Chapter 1. The Slayer's Shame. The firelight flickered in the corner of the alehouse, casting jagged shadows that danced across the stone walls. I sat alone at a corner table, my axe propped against the chair like an uninvited guest. The mug in my hand, half empty of lukewarm ale, weighed heavier than my heart. And that was saying something. Dwarfs filled the room, their boisterous laughter and the clatter of mugs hammering at my ears. None dared approach me, their sideways glances and muttered curses proof of what I had become. "Thrain Doomaxe," they whispered. "Karak Durn, the Oathless." They weren't wrong. My name, once spoken with pride in Karak Durn, was now a stain on the tongues of dwarfs from Norska to Tyle. Doomaxe they still called me, though the only doom I seemed capable of bringing was my own. I looked down at the faintly glowing brand on my forearm, a rune etched into my flesh by the last rune priest of my Karak. The lines pulse faintly like the heartbeat of a beast biding its time. A reminder of my oath, a reminder of my failure. Drakvarix. The name alone made my teeth grind. The dragon had come upon us in the dark of the deep roads, its roar shattering stone and wool alike. My clan had rallied to defend the Karak, a defiant bulwark against the tide of chaos that followed in its wake. But no bulwark could withstand a being like that. The dragon had torn through us as if we were paper, fire and shadow leaving nothing but ash and ruin. I was supposed to protect them. I was their Thane's right hand, the first to the fight and the last to leave. I should have stood my ground, axe in hand, ready to die alongside my brothers and sisters. Instead, I lived. I lived to see the smoldering remains of the halls I called home. I lived to hear the cries of those I could not save. I lived to carry the weight of their deaths on my shoulders. The elders had branded me with the oath the day I crawled out of the ruins. It was not a choice, oaths rarely are. The rune flared with every heartbeat, a burning reminder of my purpose, to kill Drakvarix the Corruptor, or die trying. Only then would my shame be absolved, my honor restored. Only then would I be worthy of joining my ancestors. Until that day, I was no more than a walking corpse, a slayer, a disgrace. A gust of wind howled through the door as it opened, cutting through the warmth of the alehouse like an axe through flesh. The noise and laughter dipped, every dwarf in the room turning to see who entered. I didn't look up. No one worth caring about ever came through those doors. "Doomaxe," a gruff voice called. I lifted my gaze slowly, taking in the newcomer. A young dwarf, his beard barely reaching his chest, stood framed by the doorway. His armor bore the crest of Karak Durn. He didn't look afraid of me, though he should have been. My scowl could curdle milk. "What do you want?" I growled, my voice as rough as the stone beneath our feet. "I bring word from Thrain Doomaxe of Karak Durn," he said, stepping closer. "There's a debt to be paid, and a chance for you to prove your worth." I barked a laugh, dry and bitter as the ale in my mug. "My worth? You've been misinformed, beardling. I've none left." The young dwarf didn't flinch. Foolish or brave, I couldn't decide. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a crude map, slamming it onto the table in front of me. "There's word of a dragon stirring in the ruins of Karak Durn. The Thane wants you to put an end to it." The room fell silent. Every dwarf within earshot had stopped pretending they weren't listening. A few muttered prayers to Grunni or Valaya. Others stared into their mugs, afraid to meet my gaze. I looked down at the map. The ruins of Karak Durn, once a proud hold, now a scar on the face of the world. The place where everything I had loved and lost still lingered in shadow and flame. The place where Drakvarix had begun its reign of terror. "Do you think you've brought me news?" I said, my voice low. "I know what stirs in Karak Durn. I've known since the day it destroyed my life." The young dwarf held my gaze undeterred. "Then go. Kill it. Do what you swore to do." I stood towering over him, despite my diminished stature. The room grew colder as I grabbed my axe and slung it over my shoulder. "Not for your Thane, not for your debt, but for my oath." As I stepped out into the night, the rune on my forearm flared to life. The faint glow brighter now. It seemed to hum in anticipation, as though the dragon itself knew I was coming. The alehouse doors closed behind me, shutting out the noise, the warmth, the stares. I welcomed the chill. It bit at my skin, but not as deeply as the shame that had already burrowed into my soul. "Drakvarix," I whispered to the wind, "your time has come." And with that, I began the march toward my doom. Chapter 2. A gathering storm. The storm broke over the mountain pass with a fury only Grimnir himself could muster. Rain lashed at my face, sharp and cold, as the wind howled like the wailing of the damned. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the earth beneath my boots. I trudged on, leaning against the gale with my axe strapped across my back, each step a defiance against both the storm and the weight of my past. It was fitting weather, I thought. Doom rarely came with sunshine. Ahead, the jagged silhouette of Karak Durn's ruins loomed against the darkening sky. Once, those halls had stood as a testament to dwarven pride and craftsmanship. Now they were little more than a scar on the landscape, broken and desecrated. Drakvarix had seen to that. The wind carried more than rain. Whispers floated through the storm, low and sinister, like voices calling from the depths of the mountain. They weren't real, at least, not entirely. I'd heard them before, back in the tunnels of Karak Durn when the dragon's shadow first descended on us. They were chaos, pure and simple, a poison that seeped into stone and soul alike. I stopped in the lee of a boulder, letting the rain batter against my cloak as I pulled out the map the young beardling had given me. The ink was smudged, the parchment soggy, but the path was clear enough. A small mining outpost lay ahead, abandoned for years, or so the map claimed. It wasn't the kind of place I'd usually waste my time on, but the whispers of Drakvarix had been growing louder, spreading like wildfire through every Karak and human settlement from here to the border princes. If even half the rumors were true, the outpost would be crawling with scavengers, cultists, and worse. And where they gathered, so too would the truth. I shoved the map back into my pack and adjusted my grip on the axe. The rune on my forearm burned faintly beneath the leather straps of my bracer, as if urging me forward. "I know, you blasted thing," I muttered. "I'm going." The outpost came into view as the storm eased, its buildings little more than crumbling ruins clinging to the mountainside. A faint orange glow flickered between the stones, firelight, not lightning. Someone was here. I crept closer, sticking to the shadows like a Groby skulker, and peered over the edge of a broken wall. A camp sprawled across the clearing, crude tents pitched haphazardly around a central fire. The smell hit me first, unwashed bodies, rotting meat, and something fouler still. Beastmen. At least a dozen of them, their twisted horns glinting in the firelight, as they sharpened weapons and grunted in their vile tongue. Chaos worshippers, no doubt drawn by the same whispers I'd heard on the wind. Beyond them I saw it, a crude effigy carved from bone and blackened wood, standing tall in the firelight. The dragon's twisted visage loomed over the camp, its maw wide in a perpetual roar. Around its base, the beastmen had scrawled runes in blood, each one writhing as if alive. Chaos runes, like the ones that had scarred Drakvarix and turned it into the monster that destroyed my clan. My grip tightened on the axe. The beastmen didn't matter. The whispers didn't matter. What mattered was the truth those runes whispered to me. Clear as day, Drakvarix's corruption began here. I was halfway across the clearing before I realized I'd moved. Rage burned in my chest, hotter than the firelight, and the need for blood sang in my veins. The beastman turned too late. My axe cleaved through the nearest one, splitting its malformed skull with a wet crunch. I let the momentum carry me forward, hacking and swinging like a whirlwind of death. They snarled and roared, scrambling to grab their crude weapons, but I didn't give them the chance. Another fell to my axe, its head rolling away as its body crumpled. A third lunged at me, its rusted blade bouncing off my shoulder plate before I buried my axe in its gut. More came. Too many. I felt their claws rake across my back, their stinking breath hot against my neck. I roared, twisting and slashing, the firelight gleaming off my axe as it sang its deadly song. For every beastman I felled, another took its place, but I didn't care. This was my purpose, my doom. And then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. The last beastman fell at my feet, its gurgling cry drowned by the wind. I stood alone amid the carnage, blood dripping from my axe, my breath rag in the silence that followed. The rune on my arm burned brighter now, its heat spreading through my veins like molten steel. I turned to the effigy, its crude features almost mocking me. The runes carved into its base pulsed faintly, their twisted shapes seeming to mock my rage. I raised my axe and brought it down with all the force I could muster, shattering the effigy into splinters. The runes flared once, their light extinguished in a hiss of smoke. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of the wind. The truth was clear now, as clear as the stormy skies overhead. Drakvarix wasn't just a monster. It was the weapon of chaos, its corruption tied to these foul rituals and the runes that fed its power. And if the beastmen had carved this effigy, there would be others. Many others. "Your time is coming, Drakvarix," I growled, staring into the horizon. "And I'll be there when it does." The storm began to rise again, the wind tugging at my cloak, as I turned away from the ruined camp and began the long march toward Karak Durn. The rune on my forearm pulsed in rhythm with my steps, a silent promise between me and my doom. Chapter 3. The Slayer's Pact. The fire in the brazier crackled weakly, its light barely illuminating the cold, damp room. I stood near the far wall, sharpening my axe with slow, deliberate strokes. Sparks danced with every drag of the whetstone, fleeting and insignificant, much like the life I still clung to. The rune on my forearm burned faintly beneath my sleeve, a constant reminder of my unfinished business. The door creaked open behind me, and I didn't bother turning. Footsteps, heavier than most, echoed in the chamber. Whoever it was didn't hesitate, didn't linger in the doorway to weigh their words like so many cowards before. That alone earned my attention. I glanced over my shoulder. The dwarf who stood there wasn't some tavern drunk or wandering mercenary. His armor was finely wrought, emblazoned with the crest of Karak Durn. His beard was long and meticulously braided, streaked with silver that spoke of age and experience. His expression, however, was not one of authority. It was desperation. "So," I said, turning fully and leaning on my axe, "the mountain sends another messenger to tug at my honor. Tell me, Thane, why should I care?" He stiffened, the lines on his face tightening. "Because you're the only one fool enough to go where no sane dwarf would tread." A flicker of amusement crossed my face. "A fine way to start a conversation, I'll give you that. Go on, then. What does Karak Durn want from me?" The Thane stepped closer, his boots crunching on the stone floor. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a rolled parchment, spreading it on the table between us. The map was detailed, far more so than the one the beardling had given me days ago. Karak Durn was marked prominently, along with the surrounding tunnels and cursed roads. Beside it was an itemized list: supplies, weapons, runestones. "I'll be blunt, Doomaxe," he said. "Drakvarix is stirring. The ruins are no longer just a lair, they're a magnet. Beastmen, greenskins, and worse are gathering, drawn to its shadow. If they aren't stopped, they'll spill out of Karak Durn like a plague, overrunning every hold from here to Zufbar." I studied the map, the faint pulse of my rune drawing my eyes to Karak Durn's name. My hands tightened on the haft of my axe. "And you think I care about your holds?" The Thane's jaw tightened. "I think you care about your oath. That dragon destroyed your clan, Doomaxe. If it rises again, it will finish what it started, and your shame will live on long after you're gone." The words cut deeper than any blade, but I refused to show it. "You're either braver or more foolish than most to speak of my shame, Thane." "I'm desperate," he admitted, "and I've nothing to offer but the chance to die in a way that matters." I stared at the map for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. He wasn't wrong. The rune on my forearm burned brighter, its heat spreading up my arm like a living thing. I had no love for the Karaks or their endless politics, but this wasn't about them. It wasn't even about me. It was about Drakvarix. "I'll need supplies," I said finally, gesturing to the list. "And a guide. I know Karak Durn well enough, but the roads to get there aren't what they once were." The Thane nodded. "Done." "And if I die," I added, "you'll tell the tale properly. No embellishments, no flattery. Let them know it was a slayer's doom and nothing more." His lips tightened, but he nodded again. Agreed. I stepped forward, extending my hand. Then we have a pact. We clasped wrists, his grip firm despite the weariness in his eyes. It was done. For better or worse, I was bound once again, not by loyalty or gold, but by the oath that burned in my blood. The Thane left soon after, and I resumed sharpening my axe. The fire had nearly gone out when the door creaked open a second time. I glanced up, expecting another dwarf messenger, but what entered the room was something entirely different. A human woman, lean and sharp-eyed, strode into the chamber with the confidence of someone who didn't care about the weight of dwarven tradition. Her armor was patched and mismatched, her sword worn but serviceable. A mercenary, by the look of her. She carried herself like someone who'd seen plenty of battle but preferred to avoid it if possible. "So," she said, her voice tinged with irritation, "you're the infamous Doomaxe. Can't say you look like much." I raised an eyebrow. "And you must be my guide. Can't say I'm impressed either." She smirked, folding her arms. "Katrin Valen. The Thane said you'd need someone to keep you from getting lost or killed. Not sure I can manage the first, but the second might be fun." I snorted. Humans always had a way of talking too much. "Do you even know the tunnels?" "Well enough. I've led plenty of expeditions through worse places than Karak Durn, though from what I hear, your little dragon problem might make this one interesting." "It's not a problem," I growled. "It's my doom." Her smirk faltered slightly, her eyes flicking to the glowing rune on my arm. "Right. Well, as long as it doesn't get me killed, we'll get along fine." I hefted my axe, testing its weight. "If you're smart, you'll stay out of my way." "Don't worry," she said, turning toward the door. "I've no interest in whatever suicidal glory you slayers are after. Just don't expect me to die for it." I watched her go, my grip tightening on the haft of my axe. She'd learned soon enough. Doom didn't care for pragmatism or survival. It came for us all, whether we sought it or not. With the Thane's pact made and the human mercenary in tow, the road to Karak Durn stretched before me like an open grave. The rune on my arm pulsed once more, brighter this time, as if mocking the faint hope that flickered in my chest. Drakvarix was waiting, and so was my end. Chapter 4. Into the deep roads. The tunnels stretched before us like the veins of a dying beast, twisted, cracked, and bleeding darkness. Once these deep roads had thrummed with life. The sounds of pickaxes, hammers, and dwarven voices had echoed in these halls, a testament to our craft and kinship. Now, the only sound was the steady drip of water from the ceiling and the crunch of boots on loose stone. I gripped my axe tightly, its familiar way to comfort against the oppressive silence. Behind me, Balric muttered a prayer to Grunny under his breath, his voice barely louder than the shuffle of his pack. Katrin walked a few paces behind, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow. She hadn't said much since we'd entered the tunnels, and I preferred it that way. Her presence still grated on me, another living reminder of how far I'd fallen. A slayer with a human guide. It was almost laughable. Almost. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the weight of the mountain pressed down on our lungs. The rune on my forearm burned faintly, its glow casting long shadows on the tunnel walls. It wasn't pain, not exactly, but it was a constant reminder of what lay ahead. "You sure you know where you're going, Slayer?" Katrin's voice broke the silence, sharp and sarcastic. I didn't turn. These tunnels were carved by my ancestors long before your kind even learned to walk upright. I know them better than you know your own sword. "Funny," she said, "because it feels like we've been going in circles." I stopped, turning slowly to face her. My hand tightened on my axe. "You think this is a game, human? You think the deep roads are just some winding trail you can follow with a map and a lantern?" Her eyes narrowed. "I think wandering blindly into the dark isn't exactly the most brilliant strategy." I stepped closer, towering over her despite my height. "These roads aren't for the faint-hearted. If you don't like how I lead, turn back. I won't stop you." For a moment we stared at each other, the tension as sharp as a blade. Then Balric cleared his throat. "Enough," he said, his voice weary. "Save your anger for what lies ahead. You'll need it." Reluctantly, I turned back to the path. "Keep up," I growled. "Or don't. It's all the same to me." We came upon the first signs of trouble not long after. A broken cart lay in the middle of the tunnel, its wood splintered and gnawed. The faint stench of rot lingered in the air, mingling with something fouler, something alive. "Skaven," I muttered, raising my axe. Katrin crouched beside the cart, examining the claw marks gouged into its sides. "Looks like they've been here recently," she said. "A lot of them." "They're always here," Balric said grimly. "Like vermin in the cracks. Where there's one, there's a dozen more." The rune on my forearm flared, as if sensing the danger. I didn't wait for the others. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the shadows, my grip firm on my weapon. The air grew heavier, colder, and then I saw them. The first Skaven lunged from the darkness, its filthy blade aimed for my throat. I sidestepped and brought my axe down in a single motion, cleaving the creature in two. Blood sprayed the walls, black and foul-smelling. More came, their red eyes gleaming in the dim light. They chittered and snarled, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. But there were so many of them. Too many. "Behind you!" Katrin shouted. I spun, catching another Skaven mid-leap with the flat of my axe. It hit the ground with a wet thud, but three more took its place. Balric swung his hammer beside me, his chants to Grunny turning to shouts of defiance. Katrin moved with surprising skill, her sword flashing in quick, precise strikes. Still, the tide pressed in, relentless. My rage boiled over. I roared, the sound echoing through the tunnels as I swung my axe in wide arcs, cutting down anything in my path. The Skaven shrieked and fell back, their courage faltering in the face of our fury. Finally, the last of them retreated, their chittering fading into the distance. The tunnel fell silent once more, save for the ragged sound of our breathing. "By the ancestors," Balric muttered, wiping blood from his hammer. "I thought they'd never stop." "They never do," I said, my voice cold. "They'll be back, stronger and in greater numbers." Katrin leaned against the wall, her face pale but composed. "And we're just going to keep walking into this?" she asked. "What exactly is the plan here, Doomaxe? Hack our way through every rat in the mountain?" "The plan," I said, stepping closer, "is to reach Karak Durn. The rest doesn't matter." She shook her head, frustration flickering in her eyes. "You're insane, you know that? Completely, utterly insane." I let out a bitter laugh. "You think I don't know that, human? I'm a slayer. Insanity is all I have left." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. For a moment, even Katrin had nothing to say. I turned away, my gaze fixed on the dark path ahead. The rune on my forearm pulsed faintly, a reminder of my purpose, my doom. I had no time for their doubts, their fears. The deep road stretched before us, and somewhere beyond the darkness, Drakvarix awaited. "Let's move," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "We're not stopping until we reach the next crossroads." They followed, their footsteps reluctant but steady. The tension between us lingered, unspoken but palpable. I didn't care. My oath burned brighter with every step, and the pull of my destiny was stronger than their doubts. Whatever dangers lay ahead, I would face them, because nothing, Skaven, shadows, or even my own companions, could stop me from fulfilling my doom. Chapter 5. Ghosts of Karak Durn. The air grew colder as we descended deeper into the mountain, the ancient stones pressing in on all sides. The weight of the earth above us was a familiar burden, but something about these tunnels felt wrong. The silence wasn't natural. No echoes of dripping water or the distant creak of shifting stone. It was the kind of silence that suffocates, the kind that crawls under your skin and makes you reach for your weapon. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a cavern, its walls carved with the sigils of Karak Durn's heyday. Great pillars rose to support the vaulted ceiling, each etched with runes of protection and prosperity, runes that had long since lost their power. Dust hung in the air like a shroud, and the faint glow of Balric's lantern barely pierced the gloom. "We're close," Balric said, his voice low. These markings, this was once the threshold to Karak Durn's outer halls. Katrin snorted, adjusting her grip on her sword. Doesn't feel very welcoming. It's not meant to be, I muttered, stepping into the cavern. My eyes scanned the room, searching for signs of danger. The rune on my forearm burned faintly, its glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. Something stirred at the edge of my vision. A flicker of movement, just beyond the lantern's light. I stopped, raising a hand to silence the others. We're not alone. At first it was just whispers, faint and indistinct, like the murmur of distant voices carried on the wind. Then shapes began to form in the darkness. Figures, barely more than shadows, emerging from the walls and floor. Their features were hazy, but there was no mistaking them, dwarfs, or what was left of them. Spirits, Balric whispered, clutching the haft of his hammer. By Grungni. The ghostly forms grew clearer as they approached, their eyes glowing with a pale, unnatural light. Their faces were twisted with anguish, their spectral bodies bearing the marks of brutal deaths, clawed wounds, burned flesh, shattered bones. They moved slowly, their steps dragging as if bound by the weight of the past. One of them, a stout figure with a beard that flickered like smoke, stepped forward. His eyes fixed on me, and when he spoke, his voice echoed like the grinding of stone. Thrain Doomaxe, Oathbearer, why do you tread these cursed halls? I tightened my grip on my axe, meeting the spirit's gaze. I come to fulfill my oath, to slay Drakvarix and end its shadow over these mountains. The ghost's face twisted, part anger, part sorrow. You seek to end what cannot be undone. The dragon's corruption is no mere curse of flame and claw. It is a vessel of chaos, bound by runes that twist its soul. I stepped closer, ignoring the warning look from Balric. Runes? What kind of runes? Runes of binding, the spirit replied, carved into its flesh by the servants of the dark gods. They feed its strength, make it more than beast, more than fire. No blade can pierce the beast without first breaking the power of its runes. Balric's voice trembled, but chaos runes they cannot be undone by mortal hands. The spirit's gaze shifted to him. No, not undone. But they can be shattered. You will need the tools of our ancestors, the power of true rune craft, to break the dragon's binding and make it vulnerable. Katrin spoke up, her voice steady despite the unease in her eyes. And where do we find these tools? If they even still exist? The spirit gestured toward the darkness, deeper into the halls, beyond the forge of grudges. There lies the anvil of Durn, the last remnants of this Karak's legacy. It is there you will find the means to strike at the heart of Drakvarix's corruption. The whispers grew louder, the other spirits closing in around us, their faces twisted with pain, their voices a chorus of warnings. Beware the beast's shadow. The runes feed on despair. You carry the burden of the fallen. The air grew colder, the spirit's anguish pressing down like a physical weight. My rune flared brightly, its light pushing back the darkness. The spirits recoiled, their forms flickering like dying embers. Enough, I growled, my voice cutting through the chaos. You've had your say. If you want vengeance, step aside and let me see it done. The lead spirit hesitated, then gave a solemn nod. We will not stop you, Oathbearer. But know this, should you fail, your soul will be bound to these halls as ours are. There will be no rest for you, no honor. I met his gaze, unflinching. I don't expect rest, only doom. With that, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The whispers lingered for a moment longer before silence returned to the cavern. Balric exhaled heavily, his knuckles white around his hammer. By the ancestors, I've seen many things, but nothing like that. Katrin shook her head, her expression grim. And here I thought the rats were the worst of it. I turned to face them, my rune still glowing faintly. We press on, to the forge of grudges, and then the anvil of Durn. If the spirits are right, it's our only chance to face Drakvarix. Balric hesitated. Thrain, those runes, even with the tools of the ancestors, do you truly believe you can break them? Chaos is not a foe easily undone. I don't need belief. I said, my voice cold. I have my oath. That's all that matters. Katrin looked at me, her eyes searching for something she didn't find. You're really willing to throw your life away for this, aren't you? I shouldered my axe, stepping toward the darkened path ahead. Aye, that's the point. They followed in silence, the tension between us thicker than ever. The road ahead would be long and perilous, but the truth was clear now. This wasn't just a dragon. It was a beast bound by chaos itself, and defeating it would require more than brute strength. The rune on my arm pulsed as I walked, a quiet but relentless reminder of the oath that bound me. Somewhere beyond the darkness, Drakvarix waited, and so did my doom. Chapter 6. The First Trio. The Chasm of Despair. The tunnel opened up suddenly, the narrow stone walls giving way to a vast chasm that seemed to stretch into infinity. A cold wind howled through the cavern, carrying the stench of damp earth and rot. Ancient bridges of crumbling stone spanned the gap, their supports cracked and crumbling, like the brittle bones of some long-dead beast. Balric was the first to speak, his voice heavy with unease. By Grungni's beard, I've not seen a place like this since the fall of Karak Durn. I said nothing, stepping forward to the edge of the precipice. Below, the darkness seemed to move, a sea of shadows that churned and whispered. The rune on my forearm burned faintly, as if warning me, but I didn't need its urging to know danger lurked here. This is madness, Katrin said, her voice cutting through the wind. You're not seriously thinking of crossing that, are you? I glanced back at her, my expression grim. You have a better idea, human? The only way to Karak Durn is forward, unless you fancy a climb. She scowled but didn't argue. Smart. That one, though her courage often tipped into folly. Balric stepped beside me, eyeing the nearest bridge with a frown. These stones won't hold for long. We'll need to move quickly and carefully. Careful. I hated that word. Carefulness was for those who had something to lose, something to live for. I had neither. We started across the bridge, single file, with Balric in the lead. The stones groaned underfoot, their edges crumbling into the abyss with every step. I followed close behind, my axe at the ready, while Katrin brought up the rear, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. The wind picked up as we reached the midpoint, howling through the cavern like a wailing ghost. That's when I heard it, a faint, guttural chuckle, carried on the breeze. Greenskins, I growled, tightening my grip on the axe. The sound grew louder, joined by the scrape of metal on stone. From the darkness ahead, crude arrows rained down, clattering against the bridge and forcing us to duck. A war cry echoed across the chasm, and shapes began to emerge, greenskin raiders, their filthy armor glinting in the dim light. Balric swore, raising his hammer. We're trapped. They've got us pinned. Then we fight, I said, already moving forward. Katrin shouted something, probably a warning or a curse, but I didn't hear her. My blood was up, the fury rising in my chest like a tide. This was what I was meant for. Not careful plans or cautious steps, but the heat of battle, the clash of steel, and the red haze of death. The first greenskin lunged at me, a crude cleaver raised high. I sidestepped its swing and brought my axe down hard, splitting its skull in a single blow. Another charged, and I met it with a roar, hacking through its guard and sending it tumbling into the abyss. A rose whistled past me, one grazing my shoulder. Pain flared, but I barely felt it. More greenskins were swarming onto the bridge now, their numbers growing by the second. I fought like a madman, my axe carving through flesh and bone with reckless abandon. Thrain, pull back. Balric's voice was distant, drowned out by the roar of my blood. I ignored him, pressing forward into the thick of the enemy. The bridge shook beneath us, the stones cracking under the strain of battle. Somewhere behind me, Katrin was shouting, her words lost in the chaos. I didn't care. This was my fight, my doom. A massive greenskin barreled toward me, its rusted axe swinging in a deadly arc. I ducked under the blow and drove my axe into its gut, twisting hard before yanking it free. The brute staggered, its blood spraying across the bridge, but the force of the strike left me off balance. The greenskins seized the opportunity, closing in from all sides. Blades flashed, slicing into my armor and drawing blood. I roared in defiance, swinging wildly, but there were too many. For a brief moment, I thought this might be it, my doom, here and now. Then the stones beneath my feet shifted, and the entire bridge groaned ominously. "Thrain, fall back," Drakvarix shouted again, his hammer crashing into a greenskin skull. This time I heard him. Reluctantly, I retreated, covering our escape as Drakvarix and Katrin cleared a path to the other side. The bridge shuddered with every step, chunks of stone falling away into the abyss below. The greenskins pressed after us, snarling and shrieking, but their weight proved their undoing. As the last of us reached solid ground, the bridge collapsed with a thunderous roar, taking most of the raiders with it. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by our ragged breaths. I leaned on my axe, blood dripping from the blade, and surveyed the carnage. The greenskins who hadn't fallen were retreating, their courage broken. "By the ancestors," Drakvarix muttered, wiping blood from his hammer. "That was too close." Katrin rounded on me, her face flushed with anger. "Too close. That was suicidal. What in the God's name were you thinking, charging in like that?" I glared at her, my rage still smoldering. I was doing what needed to be done. "What needed to be done?" she snapped. "You nearly got us killed." Drakvarix placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression weary. "Enough, both of you. We're alive, and the greenskins are dead. That's what matters." I turned away, my hands tightening on the haft of my axe. Her words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they weren't. My recklessness had put them in danger, and for what? A moment of glory. A fleeting taste of doom. The rune on my forearm burned faintly, as if mocking me. I said nothing as we resumed our march, the weight of their anger hanging heavy in the air. Somewhere ahead, Drakvarix waited, and with it the redemption I so desperately sought. But for now, all I had was the silence and the shame that came with it. Chapter 7. Relics of the Past. The ruins of the hall stretched before us, a crumbled testament to the grandeur that once was. The stone columns, carved with intricate runes, now stood cracked and weathered, their once bright carvings dulled by time and neglect. Dust blanketed everything, and the silence was thick enough to choke on. This place, the Hall of the Ancestors, was meant to be sacred, a place of memory, of honor. Now it was a tomb. "This is it," Drakvarix said, his voice reverent despite the decay around us. "The Hall of Karak Durn's ancestors. To think it has come to this." I stepped forward, my boots crunching over shattered stone and brittle bones. The rune on my forearm burned brighter here, a steady thrum that pulsed in time with my steps. There was something in this place, something old and powerful. I could feel it in my bones. "This hall holds more than memories," I said, my eyes scanning the shadows. "Something lingers here." Drakvarix nodded, his gaze falling on the remnants of a great stone dais at the far end of the room. "Aye. The ancestors' power lingers, though it's faint. If we are to find anything of use, it will be there." Katrin trailed behind us, her sword drawn and her steps cautious. "Let's just hope whatever lingers here is friendly," she muttered. "This place gives me the creeps." We approached the dais carefully, the silence pressing in on us like a living thing. Broken weapons and rusted armor littered the floor, remnants of those who had made their last stand here. My fingers tightened on the haft of my axe as I reached the foot of the dais. There, half buried in the rubble, I saw it, a shard of metal, faintly glowing with a soft, bluish light. It was wedged in the cracked stone like a splinter of light frozen in time. My heart quickened as I knelt to examine it. "By the gods," Drakvarix whispered, his eyes wide. "Is that what I think it is?" "A rune weapon," I said, my voice low, "or what's left of one." The shard was jagged and broken, no longer resembling a weapon, but still emanating a faint power. The runes etched into its surface pulsed faintly, as though the fragment itself were alive. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed the metal, the rune on my forearm flared brightly, its heat searing through my skin. The room seemed to shift, the air growing heavier. A voice echoed in my mind, not words, but feelings. Anger, sorrow, a deep and unyielding resolve. "This isn't just any rune weapon," Balric said, kneeling beside me. "This is dwarven craft of the highest order, likely forged in the days of the ancients before the fall." "It's incomplete," I said, turning the shard over in my hands. The jagged edge where it had broken off glinted dully. "Whatever this was, it's no weapon now." "But it could be," Balric said, his eyes gleaming. "If reforged, this could pierce the bindings of Chaos. It could weaken Drakvarix, perhaps even kill it." I stood, the shard heavy in my hand. "Then we reforge it." Balric's expression darkened. "It's not so simple, Thrain. To reforge a weapon of this magnitude would require materials and skill lost to time. We'd need black iron from the Chaos forged," I interrupted, my voice hard, "and the fire of an elemental forge." Balric's silence was answer enough. These things weren't impossible to find, but they were dangerous, guarded by forces that would make the greenskins and Skaven we'd face so far look like children. "What's the alternative?" I asked, glaring at him. "We face Drakvarix without it. Fight a chaos-bound dragon with steel and stubbornness alone." "No," he admitted. "We'd die before we got close. But Thrain, the cost of reforging this could be." "Everything," I growled. "And that's exactly what I'm willing to give." Katrin stepped closer, eyeing the shard warily. "You're really serious about this, aren't you? Facing that monster isn't enough. You want to go chasing after cursed iron and ancient fire." I rounded on her, my patience wearing thin. "You think I sought this out for fun, human? This is my purpose, my oath. If I have to crawl through the depths of the mountain and bleed every step of the way, so be it." She held my gaze, her expression unreadable. "You're either the bravest dwarf I've ever met, or the stupidest." "Both," I said, turning back to the shard. "And that's why I'll see this through." Balric sighed, rising to his feet. "Then it's decided. The Chaos Forge will be our first stop. I've heard rumors of an abandoned Chaos dwarf outpost deeper in these tunnels. If we're lucky, we might find what we need there." "Luck isn't what we'll need," I said, tucking the shard into my belt. "Strength, resolve, and an unyielding will to see this through." As we turned to leave, I cast one last glance at the ruined hall. The ancestors had fought and died here, their sacrifices reduced to dust and memory. But their legacy remained in this shard, a spark of hope in the darkness. The rune on my forearm pulsed again, as if to remind me of the weight I carried. This wasn't just about Drakvarix anymore. It was about restoring what had been lost, reclaiming the honor of my kin, and forging a weapon that could strike at the heart of chaos itself. The path ahead would be long and perilous, but I welcomed it. This was my doom, my destiny, and I would see it done. Chapter 8. The Chaos Forge. The air in the abandoned Chaos Dwarf outpost felt wrong. It was thick, heavy with the tang of sulfur and something darker, an almost palpable malevolence that crawled over my skin. The outpost loomed ahead of us, its blackened towers jagged and unnatural, like claws reaching up from the earth. Even in ruin, it carried the unmistakable stench of its creators, corrupted kin who had traded honor for power. "This is madness," Balric muttered under his breath, his hammer clutched tightly in both hands. "To tread where Chaos Dwarfs once walked, the ancestors wouldn't approve." "The ancestors aren't here," I said flatly, my voice cutting through the uneasy silence. "And if they were, they'd tell you the same thing I am. There's no turning back." Katrin stood a few paces behind us, her sword drawn and her eyes scanning the shadows. "Just tell me what we're looking for, Doomaxe. The sooner we get it, the sooner we're out of this cursed place." "Black iron," I said, "the kind forged in chaos flames. If it's here, it'll be near the forge." "Great," she muttered. "Just what I always wanted, playing scavenger in a daemon-infested ruin." I didn't reply. I gripped my axe tightly and stepped forward, the rune on my forearm flaring faintly, as if sensing the corruption in the air. This place was wrong, but it didn't scare me. Fear was for those who had something left to lose. All I had was my purpose. And this was part of it. The interior of the outpost was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were carved with grotesque reliefs, depictions of chaos rituals and cruel gods that made my stomach churn. The floor was littered with debris, broken tools, shattered weapons, and bones. Always bones. "Stay close," Balric said, his voice a low growl. "The chaos dwarfs may be gone, but their traps won't be." He wasn't wrong. Every step felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the air became. It was as if the outpost itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We reached the forge chamber after what felt like hours. The room was vast, dominated by a massive furnace that loomed like a dark god. Its once roaring flames had long since gone cold, but the forge still radiated an unnatural heat, as if it remembered the fires that had birthed it. "There," Balric said, pointing to a pile of twisted metal near the forge. Among the debris, I saw it, the unmistakable sheen of black iron, its surface shimmering like oil in the dim light. "That's it," I said, moving toward the pile. The rune on my arm burned brighter with every step, urging me forward. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Thrain, Katrin's voice was tense, her sword raised. We're not alone. The shadows in the room shifted, coalescing into something solid. From the corner of the chamber, a massive figure emerged. It was a twisted construct, a mockery of dwarven craftsmanship. Its body was forged from jagged metal and stone, its eyes glowing with an unnatural red light. Chains dangled from its limbs, rattling with every step. "A daemon-bound golem," Balric hissed. "Grunny preserve us." The construct moved toward us with a lumbering gait, its every step reverberating through the chamber. I didn't wait for it to make the first move. With a roar, I charged, my axe swinging in a wide arc. The blade struck its torso, sending sparks flying, but the construct barely flinched. It lashed out with a massive arm, and I barely had time to dodge before it slammed into the ground where I'd been standing. "Thrain, get back," Balric shouted, his hammer glowing with the faint light of runic power. He stepped forward, chanting under his breath, and brought the hammer down on the construct's leg. The runes flared as the blow landed, cracking the metal and forcing the creature to stagger. Katrin darted in from the side, her sword slicing into the joints of its arm. Her strikes were quick and precise, but the construct was relentless. It swatted at her like an insect, and she rolled out of the way just in time. "We can't keep this up," she shouted. "This thing's too strong." I gritted my teeth, my mind racing. The forge. The daemon binding the construct was likely tied to the forge itself, its power source. Destroy the forge, and the construct would fall. "Keep it busy," I roared, sprinting toward the furnace. "What are you doing?" Katrin yelled, parrying another swing. "Ending this." The rune on my arm flared as I reached the forge, the heat searing my skin. I raised my axe high and brought it down on the base of the furnace with all my strength. The impact sent a shock wave through the chamber, and the forge groaned as cracks spread across its surface. The construct let out an unholy roar, its movements growing erratic. It turned toward me, its red eyes blazing with fury, but Balric and Katrin blocked its path, hammer and sword striking in unison. I swung again, and this time the forge shattered. The daemon's howl filled the chamber, a sound of pure rage and pain, before fading into nothingness. The construct froze, its glowing eyes dimming, and then collapsed in a heap of metal and stone. The silence that followed was deafening. I leaned on my axe, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The rune on my forearm pulsed faintly, its heat ebbing as the corruption in the room began to dissipate. Katrin approached, blood streaked across her face but alive. "You're insane. You know that," she said, though there was a grudging respect in her tone. Balric nodded, his hammer resting on his shoulder. "Insane or not, he saved us. And we got what we came for." I turned to the pile of black iron now glowing faintly in the aftermath of the battle. The metal was still there, untouched by the destruction. I knelt and gathered as much as I could carry, the weight of it solid and reassuring. This is only the beginning, I said, rising to my feet. There's more to do and worse to face. Katrin sighed. Of course there is. We left the forge behind, the echoes of the battle fading into the distance. The black iron was ours, but the cost had been high, and the path ahead would only grow darker. Still, the shard in my belt felt heavier now, closer to becoming whole. One step closer to Drakvarix, one step closer to doom. Chapter 9. The Rune Priest Challenge. The workshop smelled of old stone, molten metal, and bitter resentment. It was carved deep into the mountain, hidden behind twisting tunnels and guarded by runes that hummed faintly with ancient power. The forge's fires flickered low, casting long shadows on walls etched with intricate carvings, each one a tale of battle, honor, and loss. Balric the runesmith sat at his anvil, his broad shoulders hunched, his beard streaked with gray and soot. His face, lined with age and weariness, was as hard as the stones that surrounded him. His hands, though calloused and worn, still held the precision of a craftsman as he inspected the shard of the rune weapon I'd placed before him. "This," he said, his voice like grinding stone, "is no simple blade. This is a relic of our people, forged in a time when the ancestors still walked among us." "It's broken," I said bluntly. "I need it whole." Balric snorted, setting the shard down with care. "You think it's as simple as hammer and fire? This weapon was forged with the heart of the mountain itself. To reforge it would require materials and magic long thought lost." I crossed my arms, my patience wearing thin. "I have the black iron. That should be enough." He turned to me then, his piercing gaze sharp enough to cut steel. "Enough for the metal, maybe. But the runes, the heart of this weapon, require something more. Without it, you'd have nothing but a blunt piece of steel." "What do you need?" I asked, though the answer already tasted bitter on my tongue. "The emberstone," Balric said, his tone heavy with both reverence and dread. "A shard of pure fire, born of the earth's fury. It can rekindle the runes and bind the black iron to the weapon." Katrin, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. "And where do we find this emberstone?" "Let me guess, some place that's as deadly as it is impossible to reach." Balric ignored her, his gaze fixed on me. "The emberstone lies in the heart of Karak Durn, a ruined forge swallowed by fire long ago. It is guarded by an elemental, a spirit of flame that does not take kindly to intruders." I gripped my axe tighter. "And that's the challenge, is it? Prove my worth by dragging this emberstone out of the fire." Balric nodded. "Aye. If you can do that, I'll know you're worthy of wielding what I forge. But if you fall," his voice trailed off, his eyes narrowing, "then you're no better than the countless fools who've sought glory and found only ash." The path to Karak Durn was treacherous, the air growing hotter with every step. The tunnels glowed with a faint orange light, the walls shimmering with heat, as we descended into the earth's fiery veins. The silence was broken only by the distant roar of molten rock and the occasional rumble of the mountain's restless heart. Katrin walked beside me, her sword drawn despite the oppressive heat. "You're really going to do this, aren't you? March into the lair of a fire elemental for a rock." "It's no ordinary rock," I said, my voice steady. "And this is no ordinary fight." She shook her head. "You slayers really are mad." "Madness and purpose often look the same," I replied. "It's not for you to understand." Balric followed behind us, muttering prayers to Grungy under his breath. The old priest had insisted on coming, though he'd made it clear he wouldn't lift a hammer unless absolutely necessary. "This is your trial, Doomaxe," he'd said, "not mine." The lair of the elemental was a vast cavern, its walls glowing with molten veins of lava. The heat was overwhelming, the air shimmering as if the very fabric of reality bent beneath its weight. At the center of the chamber, surrounded by a lake of fire, floated the emberstone, a jagged shard of pure, pulsating light, its brilliance almost blinding. And guarding it, as Balric had warned, was the elemental. It rose from the molten lake like a living inferno, its body a shifting mass of flame and molten rock. eyes of burning white light locked onto us, and its voice, if it could be called that, rumbled through the cavern like an earthquake. Who dares disturb my domain? I stepped forward, my axe at the ready. Thrain Doomaxe, slayer of Karak Durn. I seek the emberstone. The elemental's laughter was a roar of flame, sending waves of heat rolling through the cavern. Then you seek your death, dwarf. Come and claim it. The battle was like nothing I'd ever faced. The elemental moved with terrifying speed, its body shifting and reforming as it lashed out with tendrils of fire. My axe swung through its form, cutting only flame, but each strike seemed to anger it further. Balric shouted runic prayers from the edge of the cavern, his words weaving faint protections around me. Katrin darted in and out, her blade striking where she could, but it was clear this fight was mine alone. The rune on my forearm burned brightly, its heat matching the elemental's flames as if in defiance. I pressed forward, my axe striking again and again, carving through the elemental's form even as its fire seared my skin. Finally, I saw my opening. The emberstone pulsed at the elemental's core, its light flickering as the spirit's strength wavered. With a roar, I hurled myself forward, my axe slicing through the flames to reach the heart. The moment my blade struck the emberstone, the cavern erupted in light and heat. The elemental let out a deafening roar, its body collapsing into a shower of sparks as its essence was drawn into the stone. When the light faded, I stood alone, the emberstone clutched in my hand. Its heat burned my flesh, but I didn't let go. This was my prize, my victory. Balric approached cautiously, his face a mixture of awe and approval. "You've done it," he said, his voice almost reverent. "You've proven yourself worthy." Katrin sheathed her sword, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're insane, Doomaxe. But I'll give you this, you're also the stubbornest dwarf I've ever met." I said nothing, my gaze fixed on the emberstone. Its light was both beautiful and terrible, a reminder of the fire I would need to face when the time came. The rune on my forearm pulsed faintly, as if acknowledging the step I'd taken toward my doom. "This is only the beginning," I said, my voice low. "There's more to do." Balric nodded. "Aye, but with this we're one step closer." As we turned to leave the cavern, the emberstone's light casting long shadows on the walls, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. Drakvarix was waiting, its power growing with every moment. But so was mine. Chapter 10. Fire and Fury. The roar of the elemental filled the cavern, shaking the very stone beneath my boots. Flames licked across the walls, casting long, jagged shadows that danced like ghosts. It was a living inferno, a creature born of fire and fury, and it loomed for me like a nightmare pulled from the heart of the mountain. Balric and Katrin stood at the edge of the cavern, their faces pale in the orange glow. I told them to stay back, and for once they listened. This fight was mine. The elemental towered over me, its body shifting and surging with every breath. Its molten eyes burned with contempt as it spoke, its voice a rumbling growl. "Foolish dwarf, you dare to challenge me? You are but stone before the fury of the flame." I raised my axe, the rune on my forearm flaring bright enough to match the elemental's glow. "Stone withstands fire better than you'd think, spirit. And this axe has split tougher foes than you." The elemental's laughter was like a furnace erupting. "Then burn, Slayer. Burn in the flames of your arrogance." It surged forward, a tidal wave of molten heat. I dove to the side, the ground where I'd stood turning instantly to slag. My armor grew hotter by the second, the air around me shimmering as the heat closed in. This wasn't a battle I could win with strength alone. It would take something more, something the Slayer in me rarely acknowledged. Cunning. The elemental lashed out again, a massive arm of molten rock swinging toward me. I ducked low, rolling to the side and striking at its flank with my axe. The blade bit into its molten form, sending a spray of sparks flying, but the wound closed as quickly as it opened. The creature roared, spinning to face me, and I barely had time to raise my shield before a torrent of flame engulfed me. The heat was unbearable, even with the rune on my forearm flaring in defiance. My shield blackened and cracked, the metal warping under the elemental's onslaught. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stand my ground. "Keep moving," Balric shouted from the edge of the cavern. "Don't let it pin you down." "I know," I growled, darting to the side as the elemental's arm came crashing down. The impact sent a shock wave through the cavern, knocking me off balance. I hit the ground hard, the heat searing through my armor as I scrambled to my feet. The elemental loomed over me, its molten form pulsing with every movement. "Your struggle is meaningless, dwarf. You cannot quench the flames." "Quench them?" I spat, gripping my axe tighter. "I don't need to quench anything. I just need to outlast them." The cavern was littered with veins of molten rock, each one glowing faintly in the dim light. I studied them as I moved, dodging and weaving around the elemental's attacks. The creature was fast, faster than anything that size had a right to be, but its movements were predictable. It relied on its size and power to overwhelm, but I could see the patterns in its strikes, the moments of hesitation as it gathered its strength. I let it chase me, leading it toward one of the larger veins. The ground beneath us was unstable here, the rock thin and brittle from years of heat and pressure. If I could just lure it into the right spot. The elemental swung again, and I ducked, the blow glancing off my shoulder. Pain flared, but I didn't slow. I planted my feet near the edge of the molten vein and turned to face it. "Come on, then," I roared, raising my axe. "Is that all you've got?" The elemental's eyes flared with rage. "You will burn, Slayer." It lunged toward me, its massive form crashing down with the force of a landslide. At the last moment, I dove to the side, rolling across the scorched ground as the elemental's weight struck the brittle rock. The vein collapsed beneath it, a torrent of molten lava erupting and swallowing its lower half. The elemental screamed, its body thrashing as it struggled to free itself. The molten rock clung to its form like a living thing, pulling it down into the depths of the cavern. I didn't wait for it to recover. I charged, my axe glowing with the power of my rune, and leapt onto its back. The heat was unbearable, but I held on, driving my axe into the elemental's core again and again. Sparks flew with every strike, the rune on my forearm blazing brighter with each blow. The elemental's roars filled the cavern, its flames surging wildly as it fought to shake me off. With one final strike, I drove my axe deep into its core, the blade sinking into the emberstone that pulsed within its chest. The elemental let out a deafening scream, its body shuddering violently before collapsing in on itself. Flames and molten rock erupted in all directions, and I was thrown clear, landing hard against the cavern wall. When the dust settled, the elemental was gone. All that remained was the emberstone, glowing faintly in the center of the chamber. I staggered to my feet, every muscle screaming in protest, and made my way toward it. The stone was hot to the touch, but I didn't flinch as I picked it up. Its light pulsed in my hand, a testament to the power I'd just claimed. Balric approached cautiously, his eyes wide with awe. "You did it," he said, his voice almost reverent. "By Grungni, you actually did it." Katrin sheathed her sword, shaking her head in disbelief. "I'll say this for you, Doomaxe, you've got guts. And apparently the fireproof hide to match." I didn't respond. My gaze was fixed on the emberstone, its heat searing my palm, but failing to match the burn of the rune on my arm. This was a victory, yes, but it was only the beginning. Balric placed a hand on my shoulder, his expression softer than I'd seen it. "Perhaps I misjudged you, Thrain. You've shown more than strength today. You've shown honor, and the kind of will that our ancestors would be proud of." I glanced at him, my face grim. "Save your praise, Balric. We're not done yet." He nodded, his hand falling away. "Aye, but you've taken the first step, and for that, I'll forge this weapon as the ancestors intended." As we left the cavern, the emberstone's light casting long shadows on the walls, I felt something stir within me. It wasn't redemption, not yet. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like I was on the right path. Drakvarix was waiting, and I would be ready. Chapter 11. The Weapon Reforged. The forge roared to life, its flames burning hotter than any I'd ever seen. The emberstone rested in the heart of the fire, pulsing with a light that seemed alive. Around it, Balric worked tirelessly, his hammer striking the black iron with precision and power. The air was thick with heat and the tang of molten metal, and the sound of the hammer's rhythm echoed through the chamber like a heartbeat. I stood nearby, watching in silence, the weight of the moment pressing heavy on my shoulders. The shard of the rune weapon lay on the anvil, glowing faintly as if it knew what was coming. My axe leaned against the wall, forgotten for the first time in what felt like years. This was no ordinary weapon. This was something greater, something dangerous. And it would be mine. Balric paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, his beard singed at the edges from the heat. "This is no simple task," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "The emberstone's power is volatile. Binding it to the black iron, it's like trying to cage a storm." "Can you do it?" I asked, my voice cutting through the din. He looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. I can. But it'll cost more than you're ready to pay." I stepped closer, the glow of the forge reflecting in my eyes. "I've already paid, Balric. My kin, my honor, my life. What more can it take?" Balric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the anvil, his hammer ringing out once more. Sparks flew with every strike, the shard beginning to take shape as he worked. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with warning. "The runes on this weapon, they're not just a shield against chaos. They're a bond, a conduit. To nullify the corruption in Drakvarix, the weapon will need something to fuel it, a source of strength greater than any stone or fire." I felt the rune on my forearm burn, a familiar and unwelcome sensation. "My life," I said, the words more statement than question. Balric nodded grimly. "Aye. The rune on your arm binds you to this fight, and this weapon will bind itself to you. Every strike, every wound it inflicts on the dragon will draw from your strength. If you're not careful, it will take all you have and more." The revelation settled over me like a heavy cloak, but I didn't flinch. This was what I'd signed up for, whether I'd realized it or not. The oath I bore wasn't just a promise, it was a sentence, and I had no intention of breaking it. "Do it," I said, my voice steady. "Forge it, Balric. Make it as strong as it can be. I'll handle the rest." Balric hesitated, his hammer pausing mid-swing. "You're a stubborn fool, Thrain Doomaxe. But perhaps that's what we need right now." With that, he resumed his work, the sound of steel on steel ringing out louder than before. I watched as the weapon took shape, the shard fusing with the black iron, its runes flaring to life with every strike. The emberstone's light seemed to seep into the blade, its fiery glow giving the weapon an almost otherworldly sheen. The final moments of the forging were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Balric raised the weapon high, chanting in the old tongue, his voice resonating with a power that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The forge's flames surged, engulfing the weapon in a blaze of light and heat. The runes on the blade flared brighter and brighter, until they burned like stars. Then, suddenly it was done. Balric staggered back, his hammer slipping from his grasp as he slumped against the anvil. The weapon lay on the forge, its glow now steady and faintly pulsing, as though it were alive. I stepped forward, my gaze fixed on the blade. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a single-edged weapon, its surface etched with runes that seemed to shift and shimmer in the firelight. The black iron was dark as night, but the emberstone's light burned within it, a constant reminder of the power it held. "Take it," Balric said, his voice hoarse. "It's yours now." I reached out, my hand wrapping around the hilt. The moment I touched it, the rune on my forearm flared with searing heat, the light of the weapon matching its glow. Pain lanced through me, but I didn't let go. This was my burden, my doom. And it felt right. Katrin, who had been silent throughout the forging, stepped closer, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "That thing, it's not just a weapon, is it?" "No," I said, my voice low. "It's more than that. It's a key to Drakvarix's end." "And to yours," Balric added, his tone grim. "This weapon is bound to you now, Thrain. It will grant you the power to face the dragon, but it will take everything you have in return. There's no walking away from this. I hefted the blade, its weight perfectly balanced, and turned toward them. I wasn't planning on walking away. Balric stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then may the ancestors guide your hand, Slayer, and may they welcome you when your time comes. Katrin crossed her arms, her expression hard to read. You're a madman, Doomaxe. But I'll admit, you're the kind of madman who might just pull this off. I strapped the weapon to my back, the runes still glowing faintly against the dim light of the forge. The heat of the emberstone burned against my skin, but it was a pain I welcomed. This was more than a weapon. It was my purpose, my redemption. The path ahead was clear now. Drakvarix awaited, and with it my doom. But for the first time in years I felt ready. The mountain trembled as we left the forge, the weapon pulsing with every step I took. The battle was coming, and I would meet it head-on, no matter the cost. Chapter 12. Cultists of the Dragon. The air was heavy with the stench of corruption. The tunnels twisted like a snake's spine, each turn narrower, darker, and colder than the last. The rune blade on my back pulsed faintly, its glow casting long shadows on the stone walls. The deeper we went, the stronger the sensation grew, the feeling of being watched, hunted. Balric had been muttering prayers under his breath for the past hour. I couldn't blame him. The whispers had started not long after we entered this part of the mountain. Low and insidious, they curled at the edges of my thoughts, promising power, vengeance, and the one thing I craved above all else, an end to my shame. But I knew better than to listen. Chaos never spoke without purpose, and its purpose was always ruin. Do you feel that? Katrin asked, her voice low but steady. She walked a few paces ahead, her sword drawn and her eyes scanning every shadow. I nodded, my grip tightening on my axe. Aye, we're not alone. The attack came without warning. One moment the tunnel was empty save for the three of us. The next they were upon us, robed figures emerging from the shadows, their faces hidden behind masks of jagged bone and twisted metal. They moved with a terrifying speed, their chants filling the air as they descended upon us like a storm. Cultists, Balric shouted, raising his hammer as the first of them lunged at him. His swing was true, the weapon crushing the attacker's chest with a sickening crack. But more came, their blades glinting with a sickly, unnatural light. I met the charge head-on, my axe cutting through flesh and bone as I roared a challenge. The rune on my forearm flared, its light matching the blade's glow as I fought. Chaos had no place here, not in these mountains, not in this fight. I would see to that. Katrin fought beside me, her movements precise and deadly. Her blade danced in the dim light, striking down any who came too close. But the cultists were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. For every one we felled, two more took their place, their chants growing louder and more frenzied. Amid the chaos, I caught a glimpse of their leader, a tall, gaunt figure clad in robes of crimson and black. He stood at the far end of the tunnel, his hands raised as he chanted in a language I didn't understand. The air around him shimmered, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. That one, I growled, pointing with my axe. He's summoning something. Balric nodded grimly. If we don't stop him, we're as good as dead. I didn't hesitate. Cutting through the cultists, I charged toward the leader, my axe raised high. The rune blade on my back pulsed, its light growing brighter with every step. The cultists tried to block my path, but they were no match for my fury. I hacked and slashed, leaving a trail of broken bodies in my wake. But then I heard it, a scream. I turned just in time to see Katrin fall, a blade buried deep in her side. Blood spilled from the wound, dark and vivid against the stone floor. The cultist who had struck her raised his blade again, but I was on him before he could finish the job. My axe cleaved through his neck, and his body crumpled to the ground. Katrin lay on the ground, her face pale, her breath shallow. "Thrain," she whispered, her voice weak. "I can't." "You'll be fine," I said, kneeling beside her. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. The wound was bad, too bad for her to survive without help. Balric fought his way to us, his hammer smashing another cultist aside. "We need to get her out of here," he shouted. I looked toward the cult leader. He was still chanting, his voice rising as the air around him shimmered more violently. We were out of time. If I left now, we might escape, but the ritual would be complete. If I stayed, I made my choice. "Balric, take her," I said, my voice like steel. "Get her to safety." The old priest hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You can't be serious. You'll die here, Thrain." "Maybe," I said, rising to my feet and gripping my axe. "But I'll take as many of them with me as I can. Now go." "Oh." Katrin tried to protest, her hand weakly grasping at my arm. You don't have to." "Quiet, human," I growled, my voice softer than I meant it to be. "You're not dying here. Not on my watch." Balric nodded reluctantly, hefting Katrin over his shoulder. "Grunny guide you, Thrain Doomaxe." I didn't respond. My gaze was fixed on the cult leader, who had turned to face me now. His mask gleamed in the light of the rune blade, his eyes burning with a terrible light. "You think to stop me, Slayer?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You cannot stand against the will of Drakvarix." "I don't need to stand," I said, stepping forward. The rune on my forearm flared, its light filling the tunnel. "I just need to kill you." The battle was short and brutal. The cultists threw themselves at me, their blades glancing off my armor as I cut them down one by one. The rune blade burned in my hands, its light carving through the shadows and chaos alike. When I reached the leader, he tried to summon his dark magic, but it was too late. My axe struck true, shattering his staff and splitting his chest. His screams echoed the tunnel as the shadows around him dissipated, leaving nothing but silence. I stood there, breathing heavily, the bodies of the cultists strewn around me. The rune on my forearm burned brighter than ever, its heat a reminder of what I had sacrificed to get here. Katrin and Balric were gone, but they were safe. That was enough. For now. Now. Chapter 13. Secrets of the Oath. The fire crackled weakly in the corner of the cave, its light barely reaching the walls. We'd found a hollow in the mountain to rest after the ambush, though rest was a cruel joke. Balric was tending to Katrin's wound, his hands steady as he muttered prayers to Grungni. The human had lost a lot of blood, but she was alive, for now. I sat apart from them, my back against the rough stone wall, the rune blade resting across my lap. Its light was dim now, almost subdued, but the weight of it was still immense. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a part of me now, a piece of the oath I carried, burning in my blood. The rune on my forearm pulsed faintly, its light flickering like the dying embers of the fire. I stared at it, the familiar burn settling deep in my bones. It had been with me since the day I crawled out of the ruins of Karak Durn, branded into my flesh by the last rune priest of my shattered clan. My choice, they'd said. My punishment. But something about it had always felt wrong, as though the weight of the oath was heavier than any mortal should bear. Balric's voice broke the silence. "You've been staring at that rune for hours, Thrain." I didn't look up. It's hard to ignore something that's burned into your soul. The old priest finished wrapping Katrin's bandages and stood, his hammer resting against the wall beside him. "It's more than that," he said, his tone cautious. "You've always known that, haven't you?" I glanced at him, my eyes narrowing. "If you've got something to say," priest spit it out. Balric sighed, sitting across from me. The firelight made the lines on his face look deeper, his eyes shadowed by something more than exhaustion. "The rune you bear. It's not just an oath. It's a binding." "A binding?" I growled. "What does that mean?" "It means," Balric said slowly, "that you didn't take this oath of your own free will. Your ancestors placed it on you, Thrain. They bound you to this purpose before you even knew what it was." The words hit me harder than any blade ever had. For a moment I couldn't speak, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me like the mountain itself. "You're lying," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. "I wish I were," Balric said, his expression grim. "But it's the truth. The rune priest who branded you didn't do it, because you asked him to." He did it because your clan demanded it. They saw the destruction Drakvarix brought, the power it wielded, and they knew no ordinary dwarf could stand against it. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. So they made me their sacrificial goat, bound me to die for their failure? They bound you, Balric said, his voice quiet, to carry the burden they couldn't. You're not just a slayer, Thrain. You're a weapon. The rage surged within me, hot and uncontrollable. I shot to my feet, the rune blade in my hand flaring with light. They took my honor, my choice, my life, and they bound me to this cursed oath. And for what? To clean up their mess. Balric didn't flinch, though his voice softened. For vengeance, for survival, for hope. Call it what you will, but the fact remains you were chosen because you could bear it, because you're strong enough to see it through. I turned away, the blade trembling in my hands. The truth clawed at me, threatening to tear apart what little resolve I had left. My life had been a lie, my purpose nothing more than a tool for others to wield. Every step I'd taken, every battle I'd fought, had been dictated by an oath I'd never chosen. And yet, what choice did I have now? The rune was still there, burning in my flesh, a constant reminder of the path ahead. Drakvarix still lived, its shadow growing with every moment. Whatever my ancestors' reasons, the dragon's death was still the only way to end this. You think this changes anything, Balric? I said, my voice low. You think knowing the truth will make me abandon my oath? The old priest shook his head. No, Thrain. I think it will strengthen it, because now you understand the full weight of what you carry. I turned back to him, my jaw tight. I didn't choose this. No, Balric said, but you can choose how it ends. The fire crackled again, filling the silence between us. I sank back against the wall, the rune blade heavy in my lap. The rage still burned within me, but it was tempered now, focused. My ancestors might have bound me to this path, but the steps I took were mine to make. Katrin stirred then, her voice weak but steady. Thrain. I looked over, her pale face lit by the firelight. You're awake. Barely, she said, managing a faint smile. I heard shouting. You two arguing over something important. Nothing worth your worry, I said, though my voice was softer than usual. Just old ghosts. She chuckled weakly, wincing as the motion pulled at her wound. Seems like you've got plenty of those. Balric stood, his expression softening as he looked between us. We all do, but it's how we face them that matters. As the fire burned low, I stared at the rune on my forearm, its light flickering in the dim glow. The truth had cut deep, but it hadn't broken me. If anything, it had strengthened my resolve. I might not have chosen this path, but it was mine now, and I would see it through to the end. Drakvarix awaited. My ancestors' shadow loomed over every step I took, but their voice was no longer the loudest. My purpose was clear. My doom was certain, and I would meet it on my terms. Chapter 14. The Fallen Karak. The path to Karak Durn was long behind us, swallowed by the darkness of the mountain. Before us lay what remained of the hold, a ruin of ash and shadow, stripped of its soul. The once proud gates were shattered, the great runes of warding carved into their stone defaced by chaos sigils that writhed as though alive. The air was thick with the stench of decay and corruption, and every step felt like a march into the jaws of some ancient beast. Balric walked beside me, his hammer held tight, his face grim. Even he, with his prayers and runic wisdom, could not hide the fear that lingered in his eyes. Behind us, Katrin limped along, her injuries wrapped in bandages that were already dark with blood. Her steps were slow, but her grip on her sword was steady. She had insisted on coming, despite my protests. Foolish human. We stood at the threshold of Karak Durn, staring into the abyss that had once been a beacon of dwarven pride. My rune blade pulsed faintly on my back, its light dim and sullen, as if even it balked at the horrors ahead. This is it, Balric muttered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. The heart of the dragon's corruption. And the place where it all ends, I said, stepping forward. My boots crunched on the broken stone, each step heavier than the last. The rune on my forearm burned hot, a constant reminder of the oath that bound me to this cursed place. Inside the gates, the hold was unrecognizable. The grand halls that had once echoed with the sound of hammers and song were silent now, their walls blackened and crumbling. Statues of the ancestors stood defaced, their faces carved away or twisted into grotesque visages. Pools of stagnant water dotted the ground, their surfaces rippling unnaturally, as though something beneath them stirred. "We shouldn't linger here," Balric said, his voice tense. "This place is alive with chaos. The longer we stay, the more it will twist us." "Then keep moving," I growled, my axe in hand. "The dragon's at the heart of this place. That's where we're going." Katrin's voice came from behind, low and laced with sarcasm. "I love how your plans are always so straightforward. Charge into the blighted hellhole and hope we don't die." "Better than standing around waiting to die," I shot back. "Now keep up." The first trap nearly took my head. A section of the floor gave way beneath me, revealing a pit of jagged spikes coated in some viscous, glowing substance. I threw myself back just in time, landing hard on the stone as the pit yawned open. The air was filled with a sickening hiss, the spikes steaming as if hungry for flesh. "Careful," Balric barked, pulling me to my feet. "Chaos has twisted this place. Every step could be a trap." I glared at him, brushing off his hand. I noticed. We moved more cautiously after that, testing every stone, every shadow. The traps were everywhere, hidden pits, collapsing walls, and runes that exploded into shards of burning light if triggered. Each one bore the mark of chaos, a reminder that the dragon's influence had corrupted not just the hold but its very bones. But the traps were not the worst of it. The shadows moved. At first I thought it was just a trick of the flickering light. But then I saw them, creatures slithering just beyond the edges of vision. Twisted things, their forms indistinct but unmistakably wrong. They watched us, their presence a constant weight on my mind. The first attack came without warning. One moment we were navigating a narrow passage lined with crumbling statues. The next, the shadows came alive, lunging at us with claws and teeth that gleamed in the dim light. They were chaos spawn, beasts of darkness and malice, their forms ever shifting. I met the first with my axe, its blade carving through the creature with ease. But the thing didn't fall. It reformed, its body stitching itself back together as though mocking me. Snarling, I struck again, this time with the rune blade. The weapon flared with light, and the creature let out a shriek before dissolving into nothingness. "Use the blade," I shouted to Balric and Katrin. "It's the only thing that can kill them." Balric held his hammer high, its runes glowing faintly as he swung it through the nearest creature. It recoiled, its form flickering, but it didn't die. Katrin fought fiercely beside him, her sword cutting deep, but doing little to slow the onslaught. I roared, charging into the fray. The rune blade burned in my hands, its light cutting through the shadows like fire through darkness. With every strike, the creatures screamed and fell, their bodies dissolving into the air. But for every one I killed, two more took its place. "We can't keep this up," Balric shouted, his voice strained. "There are too many." "Then we don't stop moving," I barked, slashing through another creature. "The dragon's drawing them to us. The closer we get, the worse it'll be." We fought our way through the hold, the shadows closing in on us with every step. The halls grew darker, the air heavier, as though the mountain itself was trying to crush us. My arms burned with the effort of swinging the rune blade, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, we emerged into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost to darkness. At its center was a massive pit, its edges lined with jagged stones that pulsed with a sickly green light. The air was thick with heat and the smell of sulfur, and from the depths of the pit came a sound that froze my blood, a deep, guttural growl that shook the very stone beneath us. "Drakvarix." "We're close," I said, my voice low. "The dragon's just beyond this chamber." Balric's face was pale, but he nodded. "We need to rest, Thrain. We can't face it like this." "There's no time," I snapped, my eyes fixed on the pit. The rune on my forearm burned brighter now, its light almost blinding. It knows we're here. If we stop now, we're dead. Katrin sank to her knees, her breath ragged. Thrain, we're not going to make it if we keep pushing like this. I looked at her, my jaw tightening. She was right, of course. But the thought of stopping, even for a moment, made my skin crawl. Every second we lingered here was another second for the dragon to grow stronger. But even I couldn't deny it. We weren't ready. Not yet. Fine, I said, my voice low and tense. We rest, but only for a moment. Balric nodded, his expression grim. We'll need every ounce of strength we have for what's to come. As we settled into the shadows of the ruined hall, the weight of the dragon's presence pressed down on us like a storm. The rune blade pulsed faintly at my side, a constant reminder of the battle ahead. Drakvarix was waiting, and so was my doom. Chapter 15. The Guardian of the Horde. The entrance to Drakvarix's lair loomed before us, a jagged maw of stone and darkness carved into the mountain itself. The heat spilling from the depths was oppressive, carrying the stench of sulfur, ash, and decay. It wasn't just a place of corruption, it was a wound in the world, raw and festering. But it wasn't unguarded. The beast stood at the threshold like a sentinel of chaos. It was an ogre, though it was hard to call it such anymore. Its flesh had been twisted and corrupted, bulging with unnatural muscles and riddled with glowing, pulsing runes. Its eyes burned with a sickly green light, and its massive hands clutched a crude iron mace that seemed too large even for a creature of its size. The ground trembled as it shifted its weight, its guttural growls echoing through the cavern. "It's been enhanced," Balric muttered, his voice filled with disgust. "Runes of chaos. They've made it stronger faster. That thing is no ordinary ogre." "Good," I said, hefting my axe. "Ordinary's no fun." Katrin shot me a look, her hand on her bandaged side. "You're not seriously going to take that thing on alone, are you?" I stepped forward, the rune blade on my back pulsing faintly. "Stay here. This one's mine." The ogre noticed me the moment I entered the cavern, its glowing eyes narrowing as it bared its jagged teeth. It let out a thunderous roar, the sound shaking the walls, and swung its mace down in a lazy arc that shattered the stone floor with terrifying ease. I didn't flinch. My grip on the axe tightened as I met its gaze. "Come on then," I growled. "Let's see what you're made of." The beast charged, its massive feet pounding the ground as it raised the mace high. I waited until the last moment, then sidestepped, the mace slamming into the ground where I'd stood. The impact sent shards of stone flying, but I barely noticed. I swung my axe in a wide arc, aiming for the ogre's exposed side. The blade bit deep, cutting through its corrupted flesh and sending a spray of blackened blood across the ground. The ogre roared in pain, swinging its arm toward me with surprising speed. I ducked, the blow passing just over my head, and rolled to the side to avoid the follow-up strike. This wasn't like fighting the cultists or the chaos spawn. This thing was a battering ram, a mountain of flesh and fury that wouldn't fall to a single strike. It was strong, yes, but it wasn't smart. I kept moving, staying just out of its reach as it swung wildly, each blow creating craters in the stone. I watched its movements, looking for patterns, weaknesses. The runes on its body flared whenever it attacked, pulsing in time with the swings of its mace. The source of its strength, perhaps, or a tether I could exploit. The ogre lunged again, its mace coming down with a force that sent shockwaves through the ground. I dodged to the side and brought my axe down on its leg, aiming for the knee. The blade struck true, the runes flaring briefly before dimming. The ogre stumbled, its roar echoing through the cavern as it lashed out in pain. It was slower now, its movements more erratic. The rune blade on my back pulsed, its light growing brighter, as if urging me forward. I reached for it, the weapon feeling almost eager in my hands as I drew it. The ogre turned, its glowing eyes narrowing as it saw the blade. For the first time, it hesitated, a flicker of fear crossing its monstrous face. "That's right," I said, stepping closer. "You've met your match." The ogre charged again, but this time I was ready. I ducked under its swing and drove the rune blade into its side. The runes on the weapon flared brilliantly, and the ogre screamed as the light burned through its corrupted flesh. Black smoke billowed from the wound, the stench of chaos filling the air. The beast swung its mace wildly, but its strength was fading. I pressed the attack, striking again and again, each blow carving through its unnatural defenses. The runes on its body began to dim, their power unraveling under the blade's assault. Finally, the ogre fell to one knee, its massive form shuddering as it let out a final, guttural growl. I stood before it, the rune blade glowing brightly in my hands, and raised the weapon high. "For Karak Durn," I said, my voice steady, "and for every soul you helped destroy." The blade came down, striking the ogre's neck and severing its head in a single, clean motion. Its body collapsed with a thunderous crash, the runes on its flesh flickering before fading into darkness. The cavern fell silent, the oppressive weight of the ogre's presence lifting like a shroud. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, the rune blade still burning in my hands. The fight had taken its toll, but I felt no pain, only a grim satisfaction. Balric and Katrin approached cautiously, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. "You actually did it," Katrin said, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "You killed that thing." "Of course he did," Balric said, though his tone was more somber. "He's bound to this, Katrin. The rune won't let him fail." I sheathed the blade, the weight of it settling on my back once more. "It wasn't the rune, Balric. It was me." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Aye, and that's what scares me most." I didn't respond. My gaze was fixed on the darkened tunnel beyond the ogre's body, where the dragon's lair awaited. The rune on my forearm burned hot, its light almost blinding now. Drakvarix was close, and I was ready. Chapter 16, Shadows of the Past. The air inside Drakvarix's lair was suffocating. The heat was a living thing, pressing against my skin and making every breath feel like swallowing molten stone. The darkness was deeper than any I had known, broken only by the faint glow of the rune blade on my back and the occasional flicker of green light from the chaos runes carved into the walls. Balric and Katrin followed close behind, their footsteps echoing softly in the vast, empty space. Their silence was a testament to the weight of this place. Even Balric, with all his prayers and stoic resolve, seemed diminished here. The presence of the dragon was everywhere, a heavy, oppressive force that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. But something else lingered in the air, something darker. It wasn't just the dragon's power. It was something personal. "You feel it too, don't you?" Balric's voice was low, barely audible over the distant rumble of the mountain. I nodded, my hand tightening on the haft of my axe. "Aye, it's like the walls are whispering my name." "They are," Katrin muttered, her voice uneasy. "This place, it's alive." We pressed on, the tunnel narrowing before opening into a massive chamber. The walls were covered in carvings, scenes of fire and ruin, of dwarven holds falling to ash and shadow. At the far end of the chamber, a pool of molten rock bubbled, its surface reflecting the twisted imagery around us. And then the whispers began. It started as a low murmur, a sound I could almost ignore. But as we moved deeper into the chamber, the voices grew louder, more distinct. They spoke in tones I recognized, voices I knew, voices I had failed. "Thrain." And I froze. The voice was soft, familiar, but laced with pain. I turned toward it, my heart pounding, and saw Herelda, my sister. She stood among the shadows, her figure flickering like a flame. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and blood dripped from a wound in her chest, the wound I hadn't been there to prevent. "Why didn't you save me, Thrain?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You promised you'd always protect me." I staggered back, my grip on my axe faltering. "You're not real," I growled, my voice shaking. "You're a trick." Her expression twisted, sorrow turning to anger. "Is that what you tell yourself? That it's all a trick? You left us to die, Thrain, you ran." "Enough," I roared, but the shadows only deepened, and the voices multiplied. More figures emerged from the darkness, each one a face I knew, My father, his armor scorched and broken. My kin, their bodies twisted in agony. They surrounded me, their voices overlapping in a chorus of accusation. You failed us, Thrain. You were supposed to be our shield. Why did you survive when we did not? I dropped to my knees, the weight of their words crushing me. The rune on my forearm burned hotter, its light flaring against the shadows, but even it felt dim compared to the storm raging in my mind. Thrain, Balric's voice cut through the haze, but it was distant, muffled. Fight it. This is the dragon's magic. It's not real. I tried to focus, to ground myself, but the visions wouldn't relent. Elda knelt before me, her bloodied hands gripping my shoulders. You carry our shame, brother. You wear it like armor, but it's a lie. You're not a hero. You're a coward. Her words pierced me deeper than any blade. I clenched my fists, my breathing ragged. She was right. They were all right. I had failed them. I had lived when they had not. And nothing I did, no dragon, no oath, could change that. Then a hand gripped my arm, pulling me back. It wasn't a vision. It was real. Katrin's face swam into view, her eyes sharp and determined. Thrain, get up, she shouted. This is what it wants. It's feeding on your guilt. I blinked, her voice cutting through the fog. The shadows faltered for a moment, the figures flickering as though unsure of their hold on me. Thrain, Balric said, stepping beside her. His voice was steady, a rock against the storm. We're here. Focus on us, the past is gone. You can't change it, but you can fight for the present. Their words anchored me, their presence a lifeline. I rose slowly, the rune blade in my hand flaring with renewed light. The shadows recoiled, their voices turning to hisses of anger. You think you can escape us, Slayer? Elda's voice snarled, her figure twisting into something monstrous. You think you can find redemption? No, I said, my voice cold and steady. But I'll take vengeance. The rune blade flared as I swung it through the vision, its light cutting through the shadows like a dawn breaking through night. The figures screamed as they dissolved, their forms twisting and fading until the chamber was silent once more. I stood there, breathing heavily, the rune blade's light casting long shadows on the walls. Balric and Katrin stood beside me, their expressions a mix of concern and relief. You all right? Katrin asked, her voice softer than usual. I nodded, though my hands still trembled. I am now. Balric rested a hand on my shoulder. The dragon is testing you, Thrain. It's trying to break you before you even reach it. It'll have to try harder, I said, my voice grim. This doesn't change anything. My past is my own, and so is my oath. Katrin smirked faintly, though her eyes betrayed her worry. You're a stubborn bastard, Doomaxe. I'll give you that. I sheathed the rune blade, the weight of it feeling heavier now. The dragon's lair stretched before us, its presence stronger than ever. The shadows had failed to break me, but they had left their mark. Drakvarix was waiting, and I would face it, shame, guilt, and all, because this wasn't just about my past anymore. This was about my future. Chapter 17. The Dragon Revealed. The air grew heavier with every step, the heat pressing against my skin like a smith's forge. The tunnel widened, the jagged stone giving way to a cavern so vast it swallowed the light of our torches. The faint glow of the molten lake ahead cast long shifting shadows on the walls, and the oppressive stench of sulfur filled the air. At the center of it all lay Drakvarix. The dragon stirred as we entered, its massive form coiled around a mountain of broken stone and molten slag. Its scales were black as night, veined with glowing runes that pulsed with an unnatural greenish light. The chaos-tainted markings crawled along its body like living things, twisting and writhing in time with its slow, deliberate breaths. It was massive, far larger than any beast I'd ever seen. Wings like tattered banners spread out behind it, their edges frayed and torn, yet still radiating an aura of terrible power. Its eyes burned with an unnatural fire, locking onto us as we approached. The air itself seemed to tremble beneath its gaze. Balric muttered a prayer, his voice trembling. Grungni preserve us. Katrin tightened her grip on her sword, her knuckles white. That thing, that's not a dragon. It's a monster. No, I growled, stepping forward. It's my doom. Drakvarix shifted, its massive head rising as it regarded us. Its maw opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed like shards of obsidian. When it spoke, its voice was a guttural rumble, shaking the very stone beneath our feet. "Who dares disturb my lair?" it growled, the chaos runes along its neck flaring brightly. "Who dares challenge Drakvarix, the corruptor?" I stepped forward, the rune on my forearm burning with a heat that matched the dragon's aura. "Thrain Doomaxe," I said, my voice echoing through the cavern. "Oath-bearer of Karak Durn, slayer of my clan's shame, and the one who will end you." The dragon's laughter was a low, menacing growl that reverberated through the air. "Oath-bearer, you call yourself? You broken dwarf, clinging to the scraps of honor you failed to protect? Your ancestors were weak, and you are weaker still." I raised the rune blade, its light cutting through the darkness. "Heh! We'll see who's weak when your corpse lies broken at my feet." The dragon's eyes narrowed, its massive body shifting as it uncoiled. The ground trembled as it rose to its full height, its wings spreading wide. The chaos runes along its body pulsed faster now, their light filling the cavern with a sickly green glow. "Then come, little dwarf," it snarled, flames curling from its maw. "Come and meet your doom." The dragon struck first, its tail whipping through the air with the force of a battering ram. I dove to the side, the impact shattering the stone where I'd been standing. Balric and Katrine scattered, their weapons drawn, but the dragon's focus was on me. It lunged, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches from my head. I rolled beneath it, striking at its exposed belly with the rune blade. The weapon flared brightly as it bit into the dragon's flesh, and Drakvarix roared, its voice shaking the cavern. The chaos runes along its scales flared in response, the wound closing almost instantly. I snarled, gripping the blade tighter. This wouldn't be a fight of strength alone. The dragon's corruption was feeding it, healing it faster than any ordinary weapon could harm it. "Thrain!" Balric shouted, his hammer striking at the dragon's hind leg. The runes on his weapon flared as he struck, forcing the beast to recoil slightly. "The runes! They're its lifeblood! You must sever them." "I know," I growled, dodging another strike from the dragon's claws. The rune on my forearm burned brighter now, its heat spreading through my veins like molten steel. The oath was calling me, guiding me toward the beast's weakness. Katrin darted in from the side, her sword slicing at the dragon's wing. The beast roared in pain, turning its attention toward her. For a moment I saw my opening. The runes along its neck pulsed faintly, their light dimmer where the blade had struck earlier. I charged, the rune blade flaring as I brought it down on the dragon's neck. The impact sent a shockwave through the cavern, the chaos runes shattering under the blade's power. The dragon screamed, its body convulsing as black smoke billowed from the wound. But it wasn't enough. Drakvarix roots is stained bronze for its impact. Runes screamed and the flames started to grow, placing my hands on my chest and sending me flying. I hit the rune on my forearm, the air driven from my lungs as pain lanced through my ribs. The rune on my forearm burned hotter now, almost blinding in its intensity. "You cannot defeat me, dwarf," the dragon snarled, its voice laced with fury. "The power of chaos flows through me. I am eternal." I struggled to my feet, the rune blade still clutched tightly in my hand. Eternal, maybe, but everything burns eventually. The dragon roared, its flames filling the air as it charged again. I met it head-on, the rune blade's light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. This was the battle I had been born for, the moment I had been bound to since the day I took my oath. And I would see it through, no matter the cost. The cavern shook with the force of the battle, the dragon's roars mingling with the sound of stone collapsing and steel clashing. Balric and Katrine fought fiercely at my side, their weapons striking at the beast's legs and wings, but it was the rune blade that would decide this fight. The chaos runes along Drakvarix's body flared and dimmed with every strike, their power waning as I carved through them one by one. The rune on my forearm burned brighter than ever, its light driving me forward even as my body screamed in protest. This was my doom, my purpose, and I would not falter. Chapter 18. The Slayer's Sacrifice. The cavern shook with every step the dragon took, its massive form towering over me like a living mountain. Drakvarix roared, its chaos-tainted flames lighting up the darkness and carving jagged shadows into the stone walls. My arms felt like lead, my legs trembled beneath me, but I gripped the rune blade tighter, the weapon's light pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. The rune on my forearm burned hotter than the dragon's flames, the heat searing through my veins. It was alive, feeding on me, taking what it needed to power the blade's growing strength. Every swing, every strike drew from my life force, but I didn't care. My purpose was clear. My oath demanded it. This was the end, one way or another. Drakvarix lunged, its claws raking through the air as it swiped at me. I dodged to the side, the ground shattering beneath its strike. The rune blade flared as I swung, its light cutting through the chaos runes along the dragon's flank. The beast roared, its massive wings flaring as it turned to face me, the wounds already beginning to close. "Your strength is failing, dwarf," the dragon snarled, its voice echoing through the cavern. "You cannot kill me. Chaos is eternal." I spat on the ground, the taste of blood bitter on my tongue. "Eternal, maybe, but you're not." The dragon roared again, its massive tail whipping toward me. I raised the rune blade just in time, the weapon's light flaring as it absorbed the impact. The force sent me skidding across the ground, my breath hitching as pain lanced through my ribs. My vision blurred for a moment, the edges of the cavern dimming, but the rune's light pulled me back. "Thrain," Balric's voice rang out from somewhere behind me. "The blade, it's taking too much. You'll die before you strike the killing blow." "Then I die," I growled, forcing myself to my feet. "That's the point." The dragon loomed over me again, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. The chaos runes along its body pulsed brighter now, feeding off its rage, its power growing with every moment. I knew I couldn't match it, not in strength, not in speed, but the rune blade could. And that was all that mattered. I charged, the blade's light flaring as I struck at the dragon's legs. The weapon cut deep, the chaos runes splintering under its power. Drakvarix screamed, lashing out with its claws, but I was already moving, my body guided by the rune's burning pulse. Each strike drew more from me, strength, breath, life, but it didn't matter. I wouldn't need them for long. The dragon reared back, its wings spreading wide as it let out a deafening roar. Flames erupted from its maw, engulfing the cavern in a torrent of fire. I raised the rune blade, its light splitting the inferno, and charged straight through the flames. I could feel the heat searing my skin, the air burning in my lungs, but the rune's power carried me forward. The blade carved through the flames, through the dragon's defenses, until I stood beneath its massive chest, the runes along its heart flaring like a beacon. This was it. The moment my oath had been leading me to. The dragon's massive head lowered, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. "You cannot win, dwarf," it growled, its voice laced with contempt. "Your strength is gone. Your life is forfeit. Submit to chaos, and I may yet spare you." I laughed, the sound ragged and hollow. "Spare me. I'm already dead, beast. The only thing left is to take you with me." With a roar of my own, I drove the rune blade upward, its light flaring brighter than the sun as it pierced the dragon's chest. The chaos runes along its body shattered, their glow fading as black smoke poured from the wounds. Drakvarix screamed, its massive body convulsing as the blade drove deeper toward its corrupted heart. The rune on my forearm burned like molten iron, its heat consuming me as the blade absorbed the dragon's power. I could feel it draining me, pulling every ounce of strength, every breath, every heartbeat. But I didn't let go. The blade struck the heart. The cavern erupted in light and sound, the force of the impact sending shockwaves through the mountain. The dragon's roar echoed one final time, a sound of fury and despair, before it collapsed, its massive body shuddering and still. The chaos runes along its scales dimmed and died, leaving only silence in their wake. I fell to my knees, the rune blade still clutched in my hand. The light had dimmed now, its purpose fulfilled, but the cost was clear. My vision blurred, my strength fading as the rune on my forearm pulsed weakly, its burn finally cooling. Balric and Katrin were at my side in moments, their voices distant, muffled. I felt their hands on my shoulders, heard their shouts, but the weight of the blade, of the oath, was heavier than anything else. "It's done," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "The dragon's dead." "You're not dying here, Thrain," Katrin said, her voice breaking. "Not after everything." I smiled faintly, the edges of the cavern fading into shadow. "My oath, it's fulfilled. That's all that matters." Balric's voice was firm, but I could hear the sorrow in it. "The ancestors will honor you, Thrain Doomaxe. You've done what no dwarf could." The rune on my forearm flickered one final time, its light fading as the weight lifted from my soul. I closed my eyes, the darkness embracing me. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. Chapter 19. Redemption amid the ruins. The stillness after the battle was profound, broken only by the faint crackle of cooling stone. The cavern, once a place of overwhelming darkness and chaos, now stood quiet. The molten lake at its center had hardened into jagged black glass, and the suffocating air of corruption had lifted, replaced by the faint scent of ash and earth. The oppressive weight that had hung over the Karak for so long was gone, lifted by the death of Drakvarix. The dragon lay motionless in the heart of the chamber, its massive form shrouded in the dim glow of dying runes. Its eyes, once blazing with malice, were now dull, lifeless orbs. The mighty beast that had brought ruin to Karak Durn was no more, its power broken by the determination of one dwarf. Thrain Doomaxe. Balric knelt by Thrain's still form, his hammer resting across his lap. The old priest's shoulders were hunched, his face hidden behind his beard as he murmured a quiet prayer. The rune blade lay beside Thrain, its light extinguished, its purpose fulfilled. The weapon had taken all it needed from its wielder, leaving only a husk of the dwarf who had carried it. "He gave everything," Balric whispered, his voice trembling. "Everything he was, everything he had left, to see this through." Katrin stood nearby, leaning heavily on her sword, her bandaged side bleeding anew. She watched in silence, her face a mask of exhaustion and grief. The human mercenary, so often quick with her wit and sharp with her tongue, could find no words now. What was there to say? Thrain had fought for a cause greater than himself, a cause that had cost him his life, and saved them all. The corruption that had tainted Karak Durn for so long was fading. The chaos runes etched into the walls had cracked and splintered, their twisted glow snuffed out. The oppressive presence of the dragon's influence had lifted, and though the Karak remained a ruin, there was a sense of something stirring beneath the rubble. Hope. Balric rose slowly, his knees creaking as he turned to face the heart of the cavern. He raised his hammer high, the runes along its haft glowing faintly as he spoke. His voice was steady now, resonating with the weight of his faith. Ancestors of Karak Durn, hear me. Thrain Doomaxe, son of your halls, has fulfilled the oath you placed upon him. He has broken the shadow of Drakvarix, purged the chaos that tainted this place, and restored the honor of his clan. The old priest's voice grew stronger, echoing through the chamber. May his spirit find its place among the honored dead. May he stand beside the ancestors in the halls of stone, his shame washed away by his sacrifice. Katrin stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked down at Thrain, her expression softening as she knelt beside him. She reached out, brushing a gloved hand across his bloodied forehead. "You are a stubborn fool," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "But you were the bravest fool I've ever known. You deserve better than this, but you'd probably say this was the only way." She stood, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before turning to Balric. "What now?" "The dragon's dead, but this place is still a ruin." Balric nodded, his expression grim. "Aye, it is, but ruins can be rebuilt. The shadow is gone. The mountain breathes again. Others will come, drawn by the story of what happened here." "And what about him?" Katrin asked, her voice softening. Balric turned back to Thrain, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of sorrow and pride. "We'll honor him, as all slayers should be honored. He carried a burden no dwarf should have to bear, and he bore it with courage, until the end." They worked in silence, crafting a cairn from the shattered stones of the cavern. Each piece was placed with care, forming a monument that stood tall and unyielding, much like the dwarf it honored. Balric etched runes into the stones, his chisel guided by steady hands. Each mark told a part of Thrain's story, the weight of his oath, the battles he fought, and the sacrifice he made. When it was done, Balric stepped back, his hammer resting against the ground. "Let his name be remembered," he said quietly, "not for his shame, but for his redemption." Katrin nodded, her eyes on the cairn. "He didn't just save this Karak. He gave us a chance to fight back. Against chaos, against despair. He was more than he thought he was." The silence that followed was heavy but not oppressive. It was a silence of respect, of reflection. The cavern, though still and quiet, seemed to echo with the spirit of what had been lost and what had been regained. As they left the lair, the rune blade remained behind, resting at the base of the cairn. Its light was gone, its purpose fulfilled. But the story it carried, the legacy of Thrain Doomaxe, would endure. For in the heart of Karak Durn, amid the ruins of a fallen hold, a slayer had found his redemption, and the mountain would remember. Chapter 20. The Legacy of a Slayer. Narrator perspective. The story of Thrain Doomaxe spread like wildfire across the Karak core, carried by the wind and the whispers of those who had witnessed the dragon's defeat. From the high halls of Karaz at Karak to the deep mines of Barakvar, his name was spoken with awe and reverence. It was a tale of redemption, of courage, and of the unyielding strength of a dwarf bound by an oath greater than himself. Once a name muttered in shame and pity, Thrain's name was now etched into the hearts of his kin. The shame that had once stained him was burned away in the flames of his sacrifice, leaving behind a legacy that dwarves across the holds would carry with pride. In the years that followed, Karak Durn began to stir once more. Though still a shadow of its former self, the hold was no longer shrouded in chaos. The death of Drakvarix had purged the corruption from its halls, and the echoes of its dark past were replaced by the sounds of rebuilding. Word of the dragon's defeat brought dwarves from far and wide, drawn by the promise of reclaiming what had been lost. Among them were slayers, their hair bound in fiery mohawks, their faces etched with grim determination. They came to see the place where Thrain had fallen, to walk the path of the dwarf who had faced doom and triumphed, even at the cost of his life. At the heart of Karak Durn, within the chamber where Drakvarix had met its end, a shrine was built to honor Thrain's sacrifice. The cairn that Balric and Katrin had constructed became the foundation, its stones now gleaming with the light of runes inscribed by the most skilled smiths of the Karak Durn. Above it, the reforged rune blade was enshrined, its power dormant but its presence a symbol of hope. Dwarves from every hold came to the shrine, their footsteps echoing in the once silent halls. Some came to pay their respects, others to find inspiration. Many slayers knelt before the rune blade, their hands resting on the cold stone as they whispered their own oaths, vowing to carry Thrain's legacy forward in their quests for redemption. Balric, the old rune priest who had forged the blade, returned often to tend the shrine. His hands, though weathered and worn, worked tirelessly to ensure that the story of Thrain Doomaxe was never forgotten. When asked about the slayer, Balric would recount the tale with a mix of sorrow and pride, his voice carrying the weight of a life sacrificed for honor. He was more than a slayer, Balric would say. He was a beacon for us all, a reminder that even in the depths of shame, a dwarf can rise and reclaim his honor. Katrin, too, played her part in spreading Thrain's story. Though a human among dwarves, she became a welcome presence in the Karaks, her sharp tongue and unwavering courage earning her the respect of even the most stoic Longbeards. She traveled far and wide, sharing the tale of the dragon's death and the slayer who had made it possible. To the end, he carried the weight of his oath, she would say, but he never let it break him. He was stubborn, reckless, and maddening, but he was also the bravest soul of Metromatone. As the years turned to decades, Thrain Doomaxe became more than a name. He became a legend. His tale was told around hearths and campfires, in the halls of kings and the taverns of the lowliest miners. Songs were written of his deeds, their verses echoing through the mountains. Children grew up hearing of the slayer who had faced Drakvarix and won, his name becoming a symbol of resilience and courage. For the slayers of the Karak Durn, Thrain's legacy was a guiding light. His sacrifice reminded them that redemption was never beyond reach, no matter the weight of their shame. They wore his story like armor, carrying his determination into their own battles. The rune blade remained in its shrine, untouched save by those who came to honor it. Though its light no longer burned, its presence was a silent reminder of the price that had been paid to defeat Drakvarix. The inscription on the shrine's base, carved by Balric himself, read simply, "Here lies the story of Thrain Doomaxe, oath-bearer of Karak Durn. He gave his life to restore honor to his kin, and in doing so, became more than a slayer. He became a legend." And so, the story of Thrain Doomaxe lived on, not just in the halls of Karak Durn, but across the Karak Durn. His name became a rallying cry, his deeds a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a dwarf's honor could shine brighter than any flame. For though Thrain had fallen, his legacy endured, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the dwarves, and a beacon for all who sought redemption amid the ruins.